Hey everyone, it's Peter Kerr from Rock Daydream Nation, and I've got Bicyclelegs back in the seat. How are you going, mate?
Good, good. Looking forward to part two of this.
Absolutely. So we're doing a sequel to Australian albums that you must own. So the exercise is simple. Bicyclelegs and I will just choose 5 albums that you must have in your collection, and they must be Australian. So without further ado, Bicyclelegs, what's your first pick?
Well, my first pick is one that I'm quite frankly a little bit surprised that neither of us picked first time around, because it's a classic and it's as Australian as you get, as far as I'm concerned, and that is Living in the 70s by Skyhooks.
Great.
Skyhooks, great Australian band, probably the first Australian rock band to really use Australian places and themes. You know, a lot of the earlier Australian bands, you know, they sang about Memphis and they sang about, you know, Sunset Strip and
Arkansas Grass.
That sort of
Brian
thing. You
Cadd.
know? And it was really only sort of country and western artists like Slim Dusty who sang about Australian topics.
Yes.
And then Greg McCainch, who's the bass player and the main songwriter in Skyhooks, comes along and they do this album. You know, Shirl sings with an Australian accent.
Yep.
And Greg McCainch is writing about mostly Melbourne topics in particular, because they're a Melbourne band. You know, you have songs like Carlton and Toorak Cowboy and Baldwin Calling, you know, all these Melbourne suburbs in the song titles. And, you know, for the sort of early 70s, this came out in 1974, you know, the subject matter was a little bit spicy for the early 70s, especially for Australian radio, you know, singing about drugs and casual sex and protesting the war and things like that.
And all my friends are getting married.
Well, that's on the second album, but
yeah, I know.
You know, I mean, this has got Horror Movie, which is their first #1 hit. You know, a song about the horrors of the 6:30 news as it was back then. And you've got Living in the 70s, which just timeless song. Whatever Happened to the Revolution, which is about the sort of the protests against the Vietnam War and all that sort of thing. You've got You Just Like Me Because I'm Good in Bed. You know, very racy topic for sort of the early 70s. And the music, I mean, the presentation of the band was, you know, very sort of glam. They had a lot of costumes and makeup and that sort of thing. But I don't really think the music was glam as such. It was more sort of in a hard rock kind of vein. Twin guitars, nice sort of really weaving guitars too. You know, it wasn't just one lead and one rhythm. They were often playing interweaving lines together. Red and Bongo, great guitar players. Red Simons did a lot of the arranging on this album. And he also wrote the song and sang the song Smut, which just a wonderful song about getting it on in the movie theater with a packet of Twisties, which are a snack, like a cheesy sort of snack for those not from Australia who don't know. But yes, it's a wonderful album. And I think, I really can't believe we didn't mention that one first time around, because it's like a classic Australian album.
It is indeed, and I guess we didn't mention it because there's so many classic Australian albums, and to put it into 5 is very difficult.
Yes.
But a few comments on Skyhooks. Their lyrics are just sensational. And they're one of those bands, and this might be slightly controversial, where I find the lyrics more interesting than the music.
Yeah.
I find that the lyrics are very topical, even to today. I mean, in the 70s, this sort of social commentary was just very controversial. And you can see where a teenage audience that was spoon-fed something quite conservative. And Australia was very conservative in the 70s.
Oh, yeah.
And this coming out in 1974 would have basically stirred a lot of the conservative type folk. There was one radio station in Sydney called Double J that did champion and play this to the ire of a lot of the conservative, because Double J was public funded and associated with the ABC, which is a public funded radio station in Australia. And I think there was a lot of controversy when they used to play Skyhawks songs and some of the more racy ones.
Well, yeah, the very first song ever played on Double J was You Just Like Me Because I'm Good in Bed. And that was one of the 6 songs on that album out of 10 that was actually banned.
On the ban list.
Yes.
And when you ban an album, the sales go up.
Yes.
So the album hit number 1.
Yes.
And it was at the higher reaches of the charts for a considerable period of time. They were a major draw card. They did have that teenage screaming countdown, which is a music show sort of audience. But beyond that, they did have a really sizable fan base that could see through the teenage aspect of Shirl the singer and looked at the musicology and the lyrics. But to me, I always found that their lyrics were a little bit better than the music. That's just my personal opinion. I love them to pieces. I think they're great. And I just wish they'd bloody remaster the album series. Now, I know they did do what they said was remastering a couple of years ago. I've got a little box set with the first couple, but still not quite there. A lot of those old albums in the 70s, especially on the Mushroom label, which was an independent label in Australia, I wish somebody would open up the vault, get those tapes and just do a Steve Wilson remix or mastering, because they deserve that attention, especially albums like that.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely agree. The other thing I wanted to say about You Just Like Me Because I'm Good in Bed was that it was very forward thinking, not just the subject matter being of a sort of, sexual nature or whatever.
Yeah.
But also the relationship dynamic in that song, the woman is the sort of the more aggressive person in the relationship. Yeah. She's the one who's saying, you just like me because I'm good in bed.
As I said, great lyricist, putting in, that intelligence, that maturity to put it from another perspective. But at face value, it just looks like snigger, that sort of thing. Another thing I keep on adding more on this particular album, because we could talk a whole episode on it, is a horror movie as a number 1 is very unusual for that song. In 1974-75, it was Bubblegum. There was so much bubblegum pop, and for a song like that had a great deal of social commentary to hit number 1 was quite remarkable. Yeah, absolutely. And musically, that song is unusual too, because it doesn't have sort of like a strict 4/4 beat to it. It's got this very sort of, Freddie Strauss is playing around the drum kit, playing little patterns rather than playing a steady beat and that sort of thing. So it's not a record you could dance to. No. And when you think about it, like now, putting a perspective and reflecting back on it, it's like it's more of a deep album track than a single. I mean, if you listen to that album, Bicyclelegs, now, would you think that sort of stands out as the single that would go to number 1 and, is the obvious choice? No, I would have thought the title track was the obvious choice. Yep, absolutely. Well, anyway, that's a good start to the show. Good pick. I am going to go back in time to a band that was probably in competition with the Easy Beats. So we sort of a little bit cheated last time when we were looking at compilations, and we did an Easy Beats compilation. And I thought, well, if the Easy Beats were Australia's answer to the Beatles and in that beat music, well, then another band the Masters Apprentices are the Australia's answer to the Stones, and I have to include this compilation. Glenn A. Baker put this compilation for Raven Records, Hands of Time, 1966 to 1972. It's a document of the Masters Apprentices, and they're one of Australia's finest bands. They started off as a, how would I say, garage rock, had a wonderful single called Undecided. Then they sort of morphed into a psychedelic or a psych band. And then in the early 70s, they became more rocky, prototype, heavy metal, hard rock. But the consistent person for all this lineup is Jim Keys, and he was a wonderful front man, no longer with us. So many great songs. I think the songs in the discography is obviously maybe Turn Up Your Radio. That's one that's been covered by many bands. Because I Love You, which has been in every single, third TV jingle in Australia. That's something worth investigating. And likewise, some of the, Undecided and Buried and Dead. Elevator Driver, written by Brian Cadd. That's a fine song. But yeah, I think if you want to have an Australian album that samples how good the Masters Apprentices are and how diverse they are, this is the perfect compilation. It covers it all. So in the late 60s, Bicyclelegs, they used to have this Battle of the Bands. It was called Hoadley's Battle of the Bands, where you would have all these bands competing around Australia. And the prize was that you would win a trip to go to the UK and record at Abbey Road. Well, they actually won. And I don't know, maybe Doug Parkinson came second or third, but they won the prize in 1968-69. I might have my dates mixed up. They got on the boat, not on a plane, but it was like the olden days, got on the boat and, like 8 weeks later, they end up in England and they record an album. And they're recording an album right next to the Beatles when they're laying down Abbey Road. And, they played the traps around England, didn't do so well. Very hard, for a pipsqueak band from Australia to try to make it in England when you've got the, the Yardbirds, the Who, the Stones. And my favorite story is, I think the Turn Up the Radio, the sessions, they all got absolutely terpsed, and they recorded that at 2 a.m. in the morning. And the vocals on Jim Keys, he was completely off his chops. And it's one of the most it's ramshackle, it's just aggressive, it's primal. It'd do Iggy Pop proud. And it's one of the great Australian rock songs, and I love it to pieces. Also known as a band that had Glenn Wheatley, who was the bass player in a later lineup, who became the bass player of Little River Band and the manager of John Farnham, and quite uber famous in Australia. But yep, that's my choice. I think if we pick the easy beats in episode 1, you've got to pick the Masters Apprentices, and it's quite simply, if you like the Rolling Stones and you like that early Rolling Stones, check them out. They're magnificent.
Yeah, no, wonderful choice. There's not an awful lot I can add to that, other than, of course, Glenn Wheatley recently passed, but also very famous in Australia for getting done for tax fraud. But he had a label, Wheatley Records, and they had a number of sort of artists in the sort of late 70s, early 80s. One that I may mention in a future episode, who knows?
Yeah, absolutely. But yeah, that band, I just think that Easy Beats and the Masters Apprentices, in scope of influence of Australian bands, is immense.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. And like they had a bit of a renaissance in the 80s. There was another compilation, not that one, but there was the one with the big sort of like blocky logo on it.
Yes.
That came out
made
in
a
the
comeback.
sort of mid 80s. And it had a couple of new songs on it.
Yep.
And a bunch of those songs that are also on that comp. And they sort of had a bit of a resurgence in popularity.
Yeah, I saw them a few times. I saw them a few times live, and they were good. It was sort of like 3/4 of the original band. and they actually re-recorded Because I Love You. And I think in the 90s, they may have done a re-recording of Turn Up the Radio, that song I just mentioned, with the Hoodoo Gurus. So it was like a joint A single. So that's something worth checking out. I think it's on YouTube.
Yeah.
So, yeah. All right. What's your next pick?
Okay, I think I'll go for something a little bit different, something from the 80s. And Australia's not really well known. I picked last episode, I picked a progressive rock band, Sebastian Hardy, because I think Australia has not been really well known for progressive rock. I think another thing Australian music hasn't been very well known for is sort of new romantic or synth pop, that sort of thing. And so the album I want to pick is the first album by Pseudo Echo, which is Autumnal Park. And much like we talked about Icehouse in the last episode, this is definitely a band where I think their first album is their best album. It's got a great sound to it. And I think it does, you know, it stands up with any of those sort of bands from the early 80s from the UK. They were discovered by Molly Meldrum from the show Countdown. They were the first band ever to be featured on Countdown that didn't yet have a record deal. So, you know, that's something. And, you know, they were playing the pub circuit and, you know, with their synthesizers and their electronic drums and that sort of thing. I don't imagine how well they went down with the pub audiences. But once they got on Countdown, they went down a treat. This is really good music, I think. If you like your sort of, you know, early 80s Vienna sort of era Ultravox, I think there's a lot of influence from that sort of early mid-yaw Ultravox on this album. Definitely bits of Bowie and Roxy in the vocal styling, if not in the actual music sound. You know, songs like A Beat for You, Listening was the big hit, and that was the song that they did on Countdown before they even had a record deal. Fast Cars is a great song. Destination Unknown. There's actually a fair bit of guitar on this album, considering it's a synth pop album. And then they would sort of morph into, like, by the time of their third album, they did, I mean, what most people overseas will know Pseudo Echo for is what I personally consider to be a god-awful cover version of Funky Town. I've never liked it. I always liked the original of Funky Town much, much better. But they went for, like, by the time of their third album, they'd gone into this sort of arena rock kind of sound, which I don't think suited them very well. They've since made a comeback. They're playing the circuits again. They've done a couple of albums more in the style of this sound, and I think it's a lot better for them. But yeah, I think this is a really good, if you like your sort of early 80s new romantic, you know, Duran Duran and Ultravox and that sort of thing, definitely an album you should check out.
Good choice. Listening is a great Australian song. It's one of my favourites, and it's hooky as hell. And if I had to do a show of favourite Australian songs of all time, I'd always pick Listening. It's up there. I love it. And you can understand why that band got picked up for Countdown, the premium TV music show, unsigned. And that song just went gangbusters when they eventually got signed up to a record company. I think it went top 5. I find this band, as their discography went on, got less interesting. Yes. So Love and Adventure was a little bit gimmicky. I found that less interesting. And Race was a Bon Jovi-esque disaster.
Yeah.
And the chart placings of that album, I think it only hit 47. Sort of, they were just going on the hair metal sort of circuit, and that wasn't good. But the first album, It's hooky as hell. You can see it's got Gary Newman meets Ultravox worn on the sleeve. Brian Cannon is a great front man, and I've seen them recently, albeit on one of those sort of 80s nostalgia package tours at the Enmore Theatre, and they blew away the competition. They were very entertaining.
I saw them several years ago at a venue in Ipswich, which is just outside of Brisbane, and it was a pretty small venue. And considering the sort of music that they do, the thing that I found amusing was they were unnecessarily loud. Like, I was there with my niece, who's a huge Pseudo Echo fan. And that's my cat's tail, if you're wondering. And she wanted to be right up the front. So I went up with her up the front, and I had to move to the back of the venue.
Yeah.
Like after about 3 or 4 songs, because I couldn't hear anything. It was just a wall of noise. When I got to the back of the venue, it sounded great. But right up the front, it was just ridiculously loud.
Did they have the guitars out? Because when I saw them, imagine Judas Priest with guitars. It was like that. There were these 3 guys playing the guitars doing that sort of shapes. It's quite interesting, very entertaining. But Funky Town, very uninteresting song. I hated that song. That was played in the clubs in the era, flogged to death. Look, they copped a bit of flack in the day. And I think unnecessarily so. And I think they've actually, their career or that first album has had a very positive revision, because there's good songwriting, very hooky songs, and it's sort of compares favorably to a lot of the acts that came out in that era. So that's a good choice.
And nice atmospherics too. I think they get some really nice atmospheres going with the keyboards and stuff on that album.
Yep. And needs to be remastered. It's another album. So a lot of these albums that we're coming through, they just desperately need to be remastered. They're hiding, they're in the vault somewhere. Bring them out, remaster them. I'd love to see that one remastered. And there'd be heaps of like 12-inch remixes, B-sides, offcuts. Brian, if you're listening, bring it out. All right. I'm going in time to the 70s, and this is another legendary band that was probably influenced hundreds and hundreds of Australian indie alternative music bands. They picked up a sound from Detroit, from Iggy Pop, and then made it their own. So I'm talking about a band that comprises Rob Younger, Chris Mazurek, Denez Tech, Warwick Gilbert, Ron Keeley, and Pip Hoyle. And I'm talking about Radio Birdman. And I'm going to go for the second album, Radio Birdman, Living Eyes.
The non-obvious choice.
Absolutely. So this one was released in 1981 after the demise of the band. So they were signed to Sire Records. They were doing a tour with the Flaming Groovies. Things were looking up. They were going to do a tour with the Ramones, and the Ramones were kind of hot in 1978, but things fell apart. Or should I say Sire Records fell apart. They were going through some financial difficulties, and it just, the tapes were with Sire Records, finally got released in 1981. I like this album a lot. It's got some killer songs like More Fun, Doing the Moving Change, Burn My Eye, 78. The thing I like about Birdman is they're primal. It's proto-punk. It's got that Detroit Motor City rock sound, but it also has a bit of a Doors influence, and that's through the keyboards of Pip Hoyle. Pip Hoyle was like classically trained, and it adds that extra layer. It just adds that sort of more of a soundscape to their albums. And I think it's a much more accomplished album than the first one. The first one they always say is, quite influential, et cetera, et cetera. But I've always thought that album was a much more accomplished album. How many bands, Bicyclelegs, did they influence? New
Oh,
Christ, Eastern Dark, Trilobites, Rat Cat, Hard-Ons.
yeah,
That's just off the top of my head. Hoodoo Gurus,
yeah,
sort of every single. I got into the gig scene in the 80s, and I used to see a lot of these bands, and every single band used to cite them as an influence. And you'd see them wearing that, that 10 minutes to midnight, that sort of emblem. I'll put it up on the screen for our viewers, which was the trademark. Actually, you can probably see it there. See that little, everyone was wearing back patches, and it was just this mythical band that was only around for a couple of years, but their reputation was just so great. And I guess there was a groundswell of, people wanted to see them come back, and they eventually did in the early 2000s. And I was lucky to see them a few times, and they were fantastic. But yeah, not only it's like that really hard, aggressive, primal Detroit rock sound, but it had that little bit of a Doors feel to it as well. And Rob Younger, he's a charismatic frontman. He's great. And you've got Chris Mazurek and Denzer Tech. They're great guitarists. And I just think in terms of influence and accomplishment, I really love that album. So Living Eyes.
Excellent choice. And I've got to say, the other thing that I would compare Birdman with, like the Stooges, is that despite the sort of primal sound to the music, there was also an intelligence to it, and an intelligence to the lyrics.
Humor.
Yeah.
I mean, Stephen Dano, taking a Hawaii 5-0 song and, not off this album, off the other, but and making it very own. And considering, I mean, 2 Americans in the band, but it's still, you listen to it and you think it's Australian. It's got that Australian sound. It was like they took something that was overseas and distilled it into pub rock, but made it Australian and very unique. So
yeah, no, great band, no doubt. My next choice is probably going to be like very not Radio Birdman, but the one thing they probably do have in common is the sense of humor that you mentioned. Sorry, cat pulling out my earpiece. And a classic Australian band. I'm going for one of the albums that may not be the obvious choice for this band, but it's one of the first albums, probably one of the first 10 albums I ever bought as a kid. And that is Creatures of Leisure by Mental as Anything.
Very good.
This is my favorite Mentals album. Again, just as Radio Birdman had their 2 Americans, Mentals had their 2 Kiwis.
Yes.
The 2 brothers, Peter O'Doherty and Reg Mombassa. Despite the names, yes, they were brothers, because I think Reg Mombassa's real name is Chris O'Doherty. And pretty much everybody except the drummer wrote songs in this band. So you had 4 songwriters.
Quadruple threat.
Yeah. You had 2 main vocalists. Reg would do vocals occasionally, and Peter very occasionally, but you had the main vocalist in Martin Plaza and the late Greedy Smith. Their music, there was a lot of humor in the lyrics, but there was also a darkness to some of their lyrics. When you look at songs like Brain Brain and Float Away, and, they're these relationship songs, but they're very dark ones. Country in the Concrete is a real sort of commentary on urbanization and that sort of thing, sort of getting away, how Australia was becoming less and less sort of the country of the bush and more the country of, cities. And I mean, the big song off this was Spirit Got Lost, which is one of the more lighthearted things on this album, but it's a song I've always loved. again, you have, two guitars, keyboards, bass, drums. They came through on, they were artists. All of them were like visual artists. That's how they met. They were sort of like the house band for their local art college. And that's how they sort of got started. And Reg Mombassa, of course, a lot of people would know him for a lot of the designs he did for Mambo. Wonderful artist. Reg and Peter have long since left the band and have their own band called Dog Trumpet, who are well worth checking out as well. But yeah, this is a sentimental album for me because, as I say, it's one of the first 10 albums I ever spent my own money on. And it's still an album I love to listen to this very day. Overseas people, probably if they know one Mental as Anything song, it'll be Live It Up. Not one of my favorites, a little bit simple for my taste. And it got overplayed so badly in the sort of mid-80s. But yeah, I would definitely go with this as a starter if you want to get into Mental as Anything. Definitely a real quirky band. But yeah, really good fun. And yeah, with depth too, though.
Yeah, I agree. Great band. A couple of things I'd like to add is Martin Plaza has a wonderful Roy Orbison voice. Always loved his vocals. Greedy Smith, very underrated songwriter, and I disagree. I love Live It Up, and I think its simplicity makes it just so sweet. And sometimes in pop music, simplicity is all you need. And I think it was uber popular because it was a snippet of that song in Crocodile Dundee. And they used, and that went top 5 in the UK. So Fundamental as Anything is probably the most well-known overseas album out of the discography, and that's not a bad album. But yeah, I agree. Probably their earlier albums are stronger. There seems to be a bit of an obsession with rain and water. Get Wet. There was Cyclone Raymond. You look at all the names of their albums, there's a reference to climate and water. Don't know what that is. They probably plateaued. They did quite a few albums. I think, look, Greedy, I think Greedy and Martin were the X factors. They were the most valuable people in that band. And look, I think that, Greedy's passing was probably a little bit fatal. And I don't think Martin Plaza's that well.
He hasn't played live with the band for years. So I think the band is defunct now. But the Fundamental as Anything, just to give you an idea of the variety in this band, it had that sweet pop song Live It Up on it, but there's also a song on that album called Surf and Mull and Sex and Fun. Yes I love their video clips. So again, the visual artists coming out in them. Check out the video clips. Like that Spirit Got Lost is a great video clip. What was that song they did about Santa Claus? Apocalypso. Love that. Yeah. Or stop motion type of action figures. Yeah. No, very, very witty lyrics, great visual artists. And I think they're incredibly underrated, and we don't talk about them enough. They've sort of disappeared off the cultural landscape in Australia. There was probably a little bit when Greedy died. A lot of people were reminiscing how good they were and this and that. But as of 2022, I think people don't talk about them enough. I think there's an episode in that Bicyclelegs. I think we've got to raise the cultural stakes because I think they've kind of disappeared off the landscape. I think for a lot of people, they get dismissed as a joke band. No. And they really shouldn't be. Because smart. They had the pop smarts. Because absolutely. Look at their chart success in Australia. I think they held the record for the most top 40 songs in Australia for a period of time. Yeah. And a joke band doesn't get interest from the likes of Elvis Costello, who did produce a single for them and was going to produce an album, but it didn't end up happening, unfortunately. But
did they get onto Stiff Records?
No, I don't think so. I'd have to look that up.
Right. Okay.
But wonderful band.
Well, there you go. I mean, I've got that in my collection. I've got about 7 or 8 of their albums. Love them to pieces. But yeah, I didn't. Yeah, we should do a show on them. We should.
Yeah, and they did have a bit of a renaissance in the early 90s. There was I can't remember the name of the album.
Beetroot?
No, it was before that.
Garage?
It was the one that, it might have been that one that had Mr. Natural on it.
Yes.
And Nigel. I always loved that song, Nigel. The very first line of that song is, "Oh, by the way, Nigel died yesterday."
What a way to start.
Mm.
No. I've seen them a couple of times, and as I said, when you've got 4 members of the band that can sing lead vocals, and on that album, Garage, there are 4 different vocalists.
Yeah.
So if you're expecting Martin and Greedy to do the vocals, that album's a bit of a shock to the system.
Nigel is sung by Reg.
Yeah.
And I saw them open for the B-52s in about 2008 or 2009, and I actually got to meet Martin and Greedy after their set, because they actually came and went to the merch desk and were selling stuff themselves at the merch desk, which was just wonderful.
That's great. I always thought the lead guitarist looked like Paul Keating. And he's a really good guitarist too. Believe me, he might look wacky and have that sort of Undertaker look, but I've heard directly from people who have worked with Mental as anything, he is a very serious musician and very particular about his equipment. So appearances are not everything in this band.
He plays the lead guitar on the song Sounds of Then by Ganga Jang. That.
Yeah. That's wonderful.
That real sort of, he really used the whammy bar a lot in his solos and stuff, and it gave him a really distinct sound.
Look, to the overseas audience, a lot of these records and experiences, you don't know what we're talking about. Just explore it. Write it down. Look it up on YouTube. You won't be disappointed. But I think Mental as anything is a rabbit hole you want to get down. They are. It's a rewarding experience.
Yeah.
And they're a bit of a Trojan horse.
Yeah.
Looks are very deceiving.
Yes.
Because there's a lot of rich songwriting. Alrighty. Well, I'm going into the 80s, and I'm going to a very familiar band that were probably the biggest band in Australia around the early 80s. And they were also, they probably were a quadruple or a triple threat. They had 3 songwriters in the band, 2 singers. One songwriter is probably one singer is a deity up to now. I'm talking about Cold Chisel and 20th Century. Again, I'm going contrarian. So this album came out in 1984. The band was a bit in shambles. They weren't getting on. They didn't sort of have that success that they were after in America, and they were at the point of just basically breaking up. I mean, Steve Prechwitz got fired from the band. Critical appraisal of this album at that time was it's not their strongest album. But over time, I think that assessment has to be reassessed, because you've got songs like Flame Trees, which is just an Australian masterpiece. You had one of the great songwriters of Australian rock in Don Walker. He's Dylan-esque. He is somebody that speaks about the Australian experience. So how you were talking about Skyhooks? This guy, to me, brings it up to another level. And his way, he he is a wordsmith, and he can just relate these Australian experiences and make it emotional. And, you know, through the expressive singing of Jimmy Barnes and Ian Moss added to that other level is just sublime. So the things I like about this album, it's got one of the Cold Chisel's greatest songs, Flame Trees, or if not one of the top 10 Australian songs of all time, in my opinion. Saturday Night, I love that song.
That's a great song.
It's kind of, how would you describe it, Bicyclelegs? It's sort of like, it's atmospheric. It's got a little bit of doo-wop. And, you know, the film clip is basically a steady cam going through the red light district of Sydney, which is King's Cross. And it's a sort of a document of what things were like in 1983, 84. And the song starts off with all these sort of street noises and people talking. And then it goes into this really atmospheric sort of song. And you've got both Jimmy and Ian Moss. Ian Moss takes the lead, but Jimmy comes in, and they are both singing, you know, so sweetly. And the lyrics, when you look at it at face value, Saturday night, you know, boys going out, but it's actually a much darker lyric. It's about Saturday night walking away, getting away from it.
Yeah.
And the song has one of the greatest saxophone solos or outros that you could ever sort of add. It just gives a shiver to your spine. How would you describe this song? I'm sort of
I think you've described it pretty well, but I love it's got a very a great walking tempo to it.
Yes.
You know, it gives it that motion that I think the lyric is trying to convey.
It's emotional.
It is. It's an incredibly emotional song, and it's one of these songs that doesn't sort of come straight out. You know.
Yep.
I mean, it has those sort of sound effects and it just does the Saturday night bit for about a minute and a half before it actually gets into the first verse, really setting up the atmosphere for the song.
Absolutely. And, you know, a lot of people sort of thought that, and in the day that this band was like a bogan band, or to our overseas viewers, redneck, like a barroom band. And for them to come up with something so emotional and deep, because they had the weapon in Don Walker, you know, I think they are a true Trojan horse hard rock band, because there is so many layers musically as well. Ian Moss, fine guitar player, beautiful voice, ying to the Jimmy Barnes. And I love Jimmy when he in that 80s where he wasn't sort of screaming.
Yeah.
He was resting on the tonality of his voice. Because when he takes it back a notch and he sings something like Saturday Night or some of the other songs, you know, he's just got this beautiful, rich tone. But the rest of the album's not too shabby. Hold Me Tight, Janelle, I love that song with Ian Moss. Even Build This Love, a great album opener. And you've got the singers, Vanetta Fields, who was on the Rolling Stones Exile on Main Street, backup singer. She was living in Australia, so she's all over these sessions. It's got soul, it's got rock. But I've read a lot of interviews with Barnes and Moss, and they don't look upon this album very favorably. They thought it was disjointed. It was fragmented. I don't think they had a lot of fond memories. It wasn't a happy experience because, as I said earlier, Presswich was fired from the band, but he was brought back because they decided that they would quit. The band would fold, but they would do one final tour, which was the infamous Last Stand. So Presswich came back in the band, and he was drumming. But I think out of this album is sort of aged really well, and I think you must own it because it's got Flame Trees.
Yeah. And you talk about Jimmy going into that really sort of expressive singing rather than just screeching. Flame Trees is such a good example of that. His vocal on that is beautiful. And I'm not a big fan of Jimmy Barnes solo. I don't think the songs are as good. and he does definitely get into that screaming, screeching.
It's a bit AOR. He was
Yeah.
certainly he was chasing the Journey train, because he
Yeah.
was getting people, he was getting songwriters, your Desmond Childs or whoever, and he was certainly trying to chase the American radio gold, but I think he lost what made him, and Cold Chisel did make him.
But that's an excellent choice. For me, Cold Chisel, if I was picking a favorite album, it would be between that or Circus Animals.
Even
Those
East is good.
East is great too.
Those three are the sweet spot, and I will alternate at any time. But I chose that one because I've banged on about them in other shows, and I haven't spoken about 20th Century, and I think Flame Trees, being it's one of their greatest songs, you've got to have that in your collection simply because that's on the album.
Yeah. All right. Alrighty. Okay. How about we go for some Proto Metal?
Love Proto Metal.
Okay. An Australian band that I think never really got their dues. I was pleasantly surprised to find out that Pete Pardo likes this band, because I don't expect him to know a lot of Australian music. But he did do a studio, like a ranking the album show on this band a couple of years ago. And that is Buffalo.
I was about to say Buffalo. I've got that album.
Volcanic Rock. It's the only Buffalo album I've got on vinyl. I was lucky enough to pick this up for like $5.
The Vertigo.
These albums go for $200, $300, $400.
Yes.
And I was very lucky. It's playable. It's a little bit crackly and stuff, but it sounds great. On Vertigo Records too, you didn't get a lot of Australian artists on Vertigo. You got Dave Teese on vocals, Ron Baxter on guitar, Peter Wells on drums, and Jimmy Economou on drums. And it definitely is that sort of, if you think sort of early Sabbath and that sort of thing, but with an Australian twist to it, I think, with an Australian flavor to it. Yeah, I don't know what else to say about. I mean, it's 2 guitars, bass, drums, or sorry, just guitar, bass, drums, and vocals, and it says, like, how some albums sort of back in the day would say play loud. Well, on the inner sleeve of this one, it says play this album even louder.
Yes.
And it's just wonderful, explosive music, but they're not afraid to sort of stretch it out a bit too. Like on side 2, there's a long track which has an intro called Pound of Flesh and then goes into a song called Shylock. And, they really sort of extend the music. It isn't just sort of 3-chord brutal bash. There's definitely some nuance and some depth to the music, but it's definitely something, if you're into that sort of early Sabbath and sort of proto metal sounds that were coming out in the late 60s, early 70s. This was from 72 or 73? Yeah, definitely recommend this for the metalheads who might be watching.
That's a great pick. They were sort of known as Australia's Black Sabbath for a period.
Yeah.
No, that's got some really deep grooves. Stoner rock.
Yeah.
You could say, whether it's proto metal or stoner rock. Funny story, one of my friends who's a little bit older than me, Buffalo played at their school dance. So Ryde High School for year 11 or 12 had Buffalo. Can you imagine that? That was a bit of a thing in the 70s, Bicyclelegs. I hear a lot of stories that AC/DC played at their school dance. That must have been the thing, where bands would, not only they do the pubs and the clubs, but they would do the high school circuit. So I don't know if people would have been grooving to that, they might have been just sitting in the chairs and just taking it, soaking it all in. But
I don't know,
Buffalo, a couple of good albums there, haven't they?
Yeah. The Dead Forever's great too, and Only Want You for Your Body's very good too. But then
Politically
the last couple of
incorrect covers.
Yeah, but then the last couple of albums are a bit of a letdown. They were going for a more sort of commercial hard rock sound,
Yeah,
and it didn't really work for them.
Yeah.
But no, by the time I was in high school in the 80s, the best we could do at our school dance was we had, I'm still friends with the lead singer of this band. We had a real hair metal band called Vice.
I've heard of them.
Yeah, they did do an album back in the 80s.
Yeah. Right. Yeah, that name is familiar. I'll have to get offline. I'll look that up. Yeah. All right. Well, that's a really good choice. I'm now going to go into the 90s, and this band. Oh, gee, how can I say? This is I would describe them as passionate, inspiring, atmospheric, and it would definitely go in the category of they should have been huge, could have been a contender. I'm talking about Died Pretty, and I'm talking about Doughboy Hollow. It's some of the most emotional, affecting songs committed to tape, and this album to me hits the sweet spot. If you've got to have a heart of stone, if you're not affected by DC or Sweetheart or the love song, I'm talking about Ron Penno, I'm talking about Chris Wells, I'm talking about Brett Myers, John Hoey, and Steve Clark. I think it's just one of the great albums. But DC for me is just it's an anthem. It's inspirational, and it was written about Ron Penno, one of his mates who passed away, and it's just a song. Every time I hear, it kind of get emotional hearing it, and at the same time, it's just a shiver up my spine. It's turning into a cliche. I say that a lot, but I really, this is a song. And to think, when you look at the history of this band and so many of the knocks and hurdles that they've had to face, Bicyclelegs, so they record this, it gets radio play, it charts, because previous to that, they started in the early, maybe 80s, and they were kind of like a proto-punk band, very kind of influenced by the Velvet Underground and Iggy Pop, but they morphed into something that, how would I describe their music? It was more of an REM territory.
Yeah.
Sort of like more constructed pop songs or rock songs, guitar rock, but more melody. And we're starting to get this got a lot of airplay. They got signed up to Sony Columbia, and they recorded an album, I think, called Trace. They were going to be mooted as the next REM. Big things were planned for them. And they were the only Australian act to be invited to play at this Sony showcase in Scotland. One of the other bands, just to give you an idea how big shit this was, one of the other bands at the time that was invited to this showcase was Oasis. But for Sony to present this band at this showcase was big news. So they get sent over, they play a free song set, and they got dropped because one of the Sony execs didn't like the look of the band. Record industry is brutal.
Yeah.
That was basically it. Tail between their legs, went back to Australia. They were signed to Citadel Records, and they were indie. So they had that one shot. And when you think of a band that has such a great songcraft, emotion, inspirational, and quite frankly, off this album, these songs are pound for pound. I would put this against anything in the REM catalogue. I feel that strongly about it. Yeah,
I actually had in my larger pile here a Died Pretty album too, and that was Lost. It was the one I picked.
Yeah.
So I just really love the atmosphere on this album. But I won't pick that as my fifth one, obviously, because I don't want to double up. But yeah, absolutely. Great band, should have been huge.
And there's so many of those stories. There's so many of those could have, should have. You hear these stories of Australian artists that go overseas. They do this showcase gig and they fuck it up, or somebody doesn't like something somebody says, and back to Australia. It's really tough. I think it's geographically really tough for bands over here to make it overseas. And that's why you've got bands like In Excess. You have to basically pack up stumps, go overseas and bass and tour and tour and tour and tour and break through. That's the only way. You can't, it's very hard. Maybe it's different now because we're in that sort of internet age. But it's very tough in the 70s and 80s to break the world market remotely. But that story, I just find that really tragic and sad.
Yeah.
Because based on the discography, they should have just been uber huge.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we're up to a fifth one now, aren't we?
We are.
Yep. Okay. I want to go with something that is quintessentially Australian, that we talked about Midnight Oil in the last show, and sort of political music with Australian bands. This band definitely fits that category as well, and that is Spirit of Place by Goanna. The huge hit on this album was Solid Rock, which, predated Midnight Oil's concerns with Indigenous rights and that sort of thing. That song was just so powerful, and talking about, the dark side of Australian colonial history.
Yep.
Even going so far as to use the word genocide. And it's just a wonderful, really great rock song as well. But there's so many other good songs on this album. I mean, Shane Howard was the main writer and the main singer. Sang with, and still does, sings with a very broad Australian accent that you just don't hear from even Australian singers. Tend to not sing in that very broad accent. Maybe because they're going for international success or whatever, and they don't think that it will translate well. But this was a band that wasn't, ashamed to show its Australian heart on its sleeve, but also it wasn't jingoistic. It wasn't patriotic. It was talking, as I say, with Solid Rock about the very dark sides of Australian history. But you've also got songs on here like Razor's Edge, which is talking about, struggles of everyday Australian people trying to get through. Borderline is one of my favorite songs on this album. It's a really gorgeous song about yearning for sort of more. 4 Weeks Gone is sort of a song about somebody living out on one of the sort of cattle stations or sheep stations, who would, he would keep leaving to drive the cattle.
Yep.
And his wife would have to wait for him until finally she couldn't wait for him anymore. Factory Man, talking about the sort of working schlub working in a factory, that sort of thing. Children of the Southern Land. I mean, that could be right up there with Great Southern Land as far as I'm concerned, as an Australian anthem. So many good songs on this album. And, it's got to say something when the blurb on the back of this album is written by none other than Manning Clark. So.
Yeah. How would you describe the music? I have never heard the album other than the lead song. And I know it was popular and it was part of pop culture in the day. but I've never heard the album other than that solid rock song. How would you describe the music?
Musically, it's a sort of Australian pub rock, I think, with a little bit of a West Coast sound, sort of West Coast USA influence to it.
Harmonies.
Yeah, harmonies, and just the sort of the way the guitars work and that sort of thing. It was produced by Trevor Lucas. We've lost your screen again.
Yeah, keep going.
But yeah, it's just really good melodic rock, I think, with a little bit of a folk influence to it as well.
Yep.
But yeah, it's definitely an album worth checking out, and probably the most Australian album of all the ones I picked, even thinking of Skyhawks.
Absolutely. And they're reuniting. They're doing a show at the Enmore. I don't know if are they playing around your way?
I don't know.
Yeah.
If they are, I'd love to go.
Absolutely. And the follow-up didn't do so well, Oceania.
No, which is a shame, because I think that's a good album too.
Do you think it came, from memory, it seemed to come out quite a few years after?
Yeah, it was like a 3-year gap between the two albums.
Too long?
Possibly, certainly for the 80s. I mean, it wouldn't be now, but back then I think it was. And it didn't have a solid rock on it.
Right.
I mean, the lead single on that album was a song called Common Ground, which is a beautiful song. I think it's a really good song. It's a little bit more, I think that one does go even more into that sort of West Coast sound.
Yep.
Produced by Billy Payne. And I like it. I think it's a really good album. But
I'll check it out.
Yeah.
No, that's good. That's good. All right. So down to the home stretch. I'm going to a band that I must have seen 20, 30 times in the 90s. They're part of my sort of young adulthood, going around the traps. And I'm talking about UMI Hi-Fi Way from 1995. So, yeah, you've got Tim Rogers on vocals, you've got Andy Kent on bass, and Rusty Hopkinson on drums. I think this is their sweet spot. The thing that got me into buying this album was the accolades. Rolling Stone magazine and a magazine called Juice, you might remember that magazine in the day, gave this band 5 stars. I think there was a tendency in the day, a lot of the local edition sort of rags used to give a lot of bands 5 stars, maybe slightly overpraised, but in the case of this particular album, I think it's worth every single star. I think it definitely deserves the accolades. This is probably Tim Rogers, one of his finest songwriting albums, even though he says he doesn't like it. Isn't it funny how a lot of artists, their most popular, the most critically acclaimed, they don't think it was. It was produced by Lee Ronaldo of Sonic Youth. It was recorded in 7 days in New York. Apparently, Tim Rogers said he was, during those 7 days, he was on a bender. So it's kind of ramshackle, but at the same, it's got pop smarts. It's got that classic rock feel. And to me, it sounds like a cross between The Who and The Pretenders. And that's the thing I like about UMI, because, in one foot, he's got that sort of, he's got the foot in what was contemporary around that time, probably, all coming out of grunge and going into the more alternative music. But at the other foot, he's got that foot in classic rock. And, Tim, in his lyrics, it's observational. It's about relationships, talking about purple sneakers, the angst of a broken relationship. And again, like you were talking about Skyhawks, he relates this to places around Sydney, being with a lover under the Glebe Point Bridge, putting Australian sort of experiences, observational, into a 3-minute sort of pop rock song. I think it's wonderful. Caffey's Clown, Jewels and Bullets, man, that's a real banger. And those guys that like the heavy riffing and the rock, 205, that outro riff is just magnificent. It's like stoner heavy rock. So that's the thing I like about UMI. On one hand, they can just do the really melancholy sort of ballad songs, but at the other end, they can do, throw out some real bangers and get into that really heavy stoner rock. And in between, do songs that are just, classic, like have that sound of The Who or the Kinks or early Pretenders. How Much Is Enough is another great song. Simple, direct, it's heartfelt. I love the lyrics. Did you ever want to join a collective, throw a party to make sure you missed it? He's a really witty lyricist. But I've read lots of interviews and he really doesn't rate this album, or Owly Daily, which was the follow-up. He's a big fan of his later albums, and he said, look, when I started to take songwriting seriously, that's when I appreciate those albums. So, but to me, I mean, this got 5 stars in Rolling Stone magazine, and a lot of people praised it. And if he didn't take songwriting seriously, well, he's a serious talent. That's his worst effort. But it just brings back good memories, and I think it's a good document of Australian rock in the 90s, coming out in 1995. So that's my last pick, UMI Hi-Fi Way.
Good choice. Yeah. I don't know that I've got much to add to that, but it's a really good choice.
Yeah, and
if Tim Rogers is now the lead singer of the Hard-Ons.
That kind of works. Have you heard it?
No, I haven't heard any of their new stuff, but
yeah, I love the album title. Excuse me, sir, but that chord's been taken, or that riff's been taken. I think that's a classic. That's a classic album. Rightio. Well, there you go. 10. We could probably do a part 3. There's more. I'm sure you've got more.
Yes, definitely. I'm up for that.
Yeah, no, that was good. So put your comments, tell us what you think. Check out Bicyclelegs show. Have you got any, what's the latest show on your side of the fence?
Just did a top 10 studio albums ranked of Paul McCartney.
How did you do that?
Yeah, well, there were 26 to choose from, so I wasn't going to do all 26. But yeah, I did a top 10, and I was quite pleasantly surprised that it wasn't all just the early stuff, There was like albums from just a few years ago that were in that top 10 list. So he's still got it.
Oh, he has. And McCartney 3, I love that album. So I'll have to watch it and see where you ranked it, or is it ranked at all?
You'll have to find out, yeah.
Yeah. Anyway, thanks, Bicyclelegs. We'll do this real soon. So as I said, please like and subscribe, put your comments, throw what Australian albums you like, and we'll see you soon. Cheers.
Bye.